Well, thank you so much for being here tonight. We appreciate those of you who were at CYC and have returned. I assume that all of the ones who went down there also came back. I like to say when I take a group of kids, I like to come back with at least as many as I leave with. And so hopefully that is the case with you all. We began this morning and we talked about a villain from the Bible, and we focused on the Old Testament, and in particular we mentioned Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, mentioned in Exodus chapter 1 and verse 8, and we referenced him as certainly a bad guy in the Bible. And we're going to notice another one this evening, and this one will be a little bit different. Our villain this evening is from the New Testament, and he's a man by the name of Pontius Pilate. If you know anything about character development, you know that there are two types of characters. There are flat characters, that is, a character who has only one type of trait. Pharaoh, as he is depicted in Exodus, is a flat character. There are no redeeming qualities to Pharaoh as he's depicted in Exodus. I don't know personally if he had any or not, but most people are round characters. That is, they have some good qualities, they have some bad qualities. They have some qualities that would be categorized as beneficial and good and kind, and others that maybe would be on the spectrum of badness. I think that can be said about Pilate. In fact, there is much that is redeemable about Pilate as he is described in the pages of the New Testament. And so as we go through this discussion of Pilate tonight, we're going to outline the many good qualities that set Pilate in a position to do something positive, but unfortunately, he did not. And it's for that reason, as much as any other, that Pilate is a villain in the New Testament narrative, and certainly he is. In the historical accounts that we have in the New Testament, Pilate takes center stage for a portion of that as a villain in the Bible. So as we think about him, though, let's think about some advantages that Pilate would have had that could have prevented him from taking that role as villain. Well, and I was going to mention some of the villains that we obviously understand are bad themselves. Pharaoh was a complete and total villain. Jezebel. Any redeeming qualities that we know about Jezebel? Certainly not. I ask the question whenever Jezebel comes up, do you know any women named Jezebel? That's certainly not a name. When you walk through Cracker Barrel, you're not going to get a mug that has Jezebel on it. They just don't offer those because Jezebel has gone down in infamy as a villain in the biblical record. Pilate, though, has some positives that we could consider. We think, first of all, about his position. And the position that Pilate was in could have afforded him the opportunity to have done something very positive. First of all, his position was one of privilege. The name Pontius was a family name. Excuse me. It places him among the Samnite people, a people that was overcome and absorbed into the Roman Empire. There was a Pontius who led during a victory over the Roman army during that opposition. After they were absorbed into Rome, there was a Pontius involved in the assassination of Julius Caesar. And so the Pontius name is a prominent name in Roman history. And so Pontius Pilate came from a family of privilege. Pilate would have been a member of the noble class, and he had all of the privileges of that noble class. But so not only, though, was he a person of privilege, but he was also someone who found himself in a position of power. In Matthew 27 and verse 2, I believe in Luke chapter 3 as well, Pontius is described as a governor. His official title in the Roman hierarchy would have been procurator. As such, he would have been someone whom the emperor gave official capacities. Now, different procurators had different official capacities. Some of them had capacities that were very limited, only maybe to financial things. But he was in charge of much more. Pilate not only had financial or fiscal responsibilities, but he had military, civil, and criminal jurisdiction over the province of Judea. You see, the emperor had given him that power. He had the power to make decisions concerning sentencing and concerning civil disputes. In John 19 and verse 10, Pilate is going to tell Jesus, I have the power to crucify thee and to release thee. That's John 19 verse 10. So we see Pilate as a man in a position of privilege and a man who is in position of power. The Roman government had encouraged Pilate to pacify as much as he could the Jewish society over which he ruled. But Pilate, for a good portion of his rule, did not do that. At one point, he brought the Roman armies in with their banners. And their banners depicted the emperor. And the Jewish people highly detested that because it represented emperor worship. Well, Pilate said, if you don't like it, come in here and essentially I will execute you. Well, a group of the Jewish leaders came in and they revealed their necks to Pilate and they laid down on the ground. Pilate, unwilling to cause that kind of a stir, sent the Romans back out and got rid of the banners. There was another instance, though, where Pilate, in order to make a viaduct to bring water in, he took money that was Corban, that had been dedicated to the treasury. The Jews raised a fuss. Pilate put down that rebellion. So Pilate wasn't always very interested in appeasing the Jewish people. And I want you to put that in the back of your mind as we move forward. So Pilate had a position that he could have used for good. A position of privilege and a position of power. But as we dive more deeply into Pilate, we see Pilate's personality. And there are parts of Pilate's personality that are depicted in the New Testament record that could have allowed him to have done something wonderful. Now, I'm not going to say that Pilate was, in every aspect of his life, an upstanding person. The biblical record says that he had, for the Galileans, mingled their blood with their sacrifices. Now, we don't really know what all that entails, but there were instances in which Pilate was ruthless and merciless. But in what we have in his relationship to Jesus' trial, we see, number one, that he was discriminating. What do we mean by that? We mean Pilate knew the difference between right and wrong. Pilate could recognize innocence. And that is something certainly commendable about Pilate. Go to Matthew chapter 27, and we're just going to look at a few of these passages here this evening. Matthew chapter 27, you pick up in verse 23. The governor, that is Pilate, asked the throng, why? What evil has he done? Notice that question. We're going to see in John's account that there are 7 questions that are asked in John's account, and we'll notice those here in just a moment. But notice that question in verse 23, why? What evil has he done? Pilate recognizes he's innocent. In fact, in verse 24, when Pilate saw that he could prevail nothing, but that rather a tumult was made, he took water and washed his hands before the multitude, saying, I'm innocent of the blood of this what? Just person. Now, Pilate's symbolic washing of his hands did nothing to remove the guilt from his part of this event. But notice he calls him a just person. He recognizes the innocence in Jesus Christ. He is discriminating. And that is certainly something positive that can be said about Pilate. Mark 15 and verse 14. Again, Pilate says in Mark's account, "Why, what evil has he done?" And that question echoes through each of the gospel accounts. In chapter 23, in verse 4, Pilate said to the chief priests, to the people, "I find no fault in him." In verse 14, he said unto them, "You have brought this man unto me." You're going to bring me a cough drop? I didn't know if you were coming to stop me. I love Ken to death, but if I could vote someone likely to come and stop the sermon because he agrees with something, he would be at the top of the list. He's that curmudgeonly. I believe that he would do that. I'm just joking, of course, but thank you, Ken. I get to simultaneously make fun of Ken and anger my wife. She doesn't like me having lozenges or candies in my mouth while I preach. But when an old man wastes his energy to come up here and give that to me, there's not much I can do. I mean, I don't know how many more times he's going to be able to come up here and do that, so I've got to take advantage of it. Verse 14 of Luke chapter 23. Pilate said, "You have brought this man unto me as one that perverteth the people. And behold," I want you to notice how discerning he is. "And behold, I, having examined him before you, have found no fault in this man, touching those things whereof you accuse him." This is a discriminating man. This is a man who is able to discern good and evil, right and wrong. And he has examined Jesus, and as an objective party, I said, there's nothing wrong with this man. There's nothing in this man that would make him worthy of death. In verse 15 he says, "Nor know yet Herod, for I sent you to him, and lo, nothing worthy of death is done unto him. I will therefore chastise him and release him." In verse 22 he asks again, "Why, what evil has he done? I have found no cause of death in him. I will therefore chastise him and let him go." If there is nothing else that we can say about Pilate, he recognizes and he voices the innocence of the Savior. He is discriminating. You go to John's account in John chapter 18 and verse 38, we see it again echoed. What is truth? That famous question. But when he said that, he went out again unto the Jews and says, "I find no fault in him at all." So he recognizes and he, on a number of occasions, underscores the innocence of Jesus. Again in chapter 19 and verse 4, "I find no fault in him." Again in verse 6, "I find no fault in him." Over and over again, he was discriminating. But not only that, he was interested. Have you ever thought of the difference between how Herod treated Jesus and how Pilate treated Jesus? He was a mockery and a laughingstock. But before Pilate, not. In fact, John's account, and I mentioned those 7 questions. I want you to go with me to John chapter 18, and let's just quickly look through those 7 questions in John's account. It says, "Pilate entered into the judgment hall again and called Jesus and said, Art thou the King of the Jews?" In verse 35, "Am I a Jew?" He says at the end of verse 35, "What hast thou done?" In verse 37, he says, "Art thou a king then?" In verse 38, he says, "What is truth?" And we could dispute for the rest of this service what he intends with that question. But he's asking questions of the Savior. In chapter 19 and verse 9, he went again to the judgment hall and says, "Whence art thou?" In verse 10, he says, Jesus responds, "You could have no power at all against me except it were given thee from above." We recognize that Pilate over and over again asks questions of Jesus. He even in verse 15 asks questions of the crowd. "Shall I crucify your king?" At least 3 times in Luke chapter 23 and verse 20 is but one example. Pilate asks the people, Whom shall you that I release unto you? He earnestly intends to release Jesus. But the people are not to be convinced. He was discriminating. He was interested. And I use this term only as it applies to this specific situation. He was just. His initial desire was to do justice on the part of Jesus. Go to Luke chapter 23 and pick up in verse 1. And the whole multitude of them arose and led them unto Pilate, and they began to accuse him, saying, We found this fellow perverting the nation, forbidding to give tribute to Caesar, saying himself is Christ a king. And Pilate asked him, saying, Art thou king of the Jews? And he answered him and said, Thou sayest it. And then I want you to notice what Pilate's early verdict is. I find no fault in this man. If it were up to Pilate at that very moment, the verdict had been read. He's innocent. And I'm going to let him go. That was Pilate's initial desire. So have you noticed that we've sort of depicted Pilate as a decent fella? But he's a villain. How? How could a man with so much potential to do good, how could he be a villain? Well, we get to his performance and we see. Out of all of the things that Pilate could have done, it's what he actually did that caused the problem. He was positioned to make the right decision. He had the power to do it. He had the personality to do it. We see that he recognized innocence. He was discriminating. We see that he was interested in what Jesus had to say. He listened. We see that he was just, at least in a portion of the trial. He had the potential to make the right decision. And yet, he allowed himself to be provoked to make the wrong decision. Now notice how I said that. He allowed himself to be provoked. We're certainly not going to paint Pilate as an unwilling participant in these events. Pilate had the power to do whatever he wished. And Pilate had demonstrated in the past, remember I said, keep it in the back of your mind that Pilate didn't really care about appeasing the Jews in every instance. There were times he had proven himself not too concerned about the Jews' opinion of him. And yet all of a sudden now, he cares. He wants to appease the Jews. He wants to keep the tumult down, when there were certainly times in history when he didn't care so much about doing that. But he allowed himself to be provoked to make the wrong decision. Matthew 27, verse 24. Notice what's said here. When Pilate saw that he could prevail nothing. You know, it's interesting that it's phrased that way. But that rather a tumult was made, he said, I'm innocent of the blood of this just person, see you to it. And they said, verse 25, His blood be on us and on our children. He allowed them to dictate his behavior. In Mark chapter 15, we see it again. In verse 15, and so Pilate, willing to content the people, released Barabbas. Pilate made a conscious, willing decision to appease the multitude. In Luke chapter 23, we see that same thing depicted again in verse 20. Pilate, therefore, willing to release Jesus. Notice what he wanted to do, but they cried, saying, Crucify him, crucify him. We read, What evil has he done? Verse 23, they were instant with loud voices, requiring that he might be crucified. And the voices of them and of the chief priests prevailed, because Pilate allowed that to happen. And Pilate gave sentence that it should be as they required. He even offered, in verse 16, he says, I'll therefore chastise him and release him. We noticed he said that on at least 2 occasions. He offered to scourge and release. He even offered to trade him. Hey, well, who do you want, Barabbas or Jesus? He gave them that opportunity. But he did not seize the opportunity that he had to do the right thing. And it's for that reason, in this instance, that Pilate is a villain. So my question for you and me tonight is this: how do we avoid being a villain in that way? Are you telling me that we can be discerning, that we can know good and evil, that we can be in the position to make the right decision, that we can have everything that we need to make the right decision, and we can still make the wrong one and become the villain in God's plan? And unfortunately, that's absolutely the case. So what do we need to do? What can we learn from Pilate? Number one, we must prepare ourselves to discern good and evil. If we can take one positive thing from Pilate, it's that he recognized innocence, he recognized what was right. Now, he did not have the courage, the intestinal fortitude to do it, but he recognized what was right. We need to prepare ourselves through diligence, 2 Timothy 2:15, to handle correctly the word of truth, to be able to apply it to situations and determine what it is that we are to do. Hebrews 5 and verse 14, we need to have our senses exercised to discern good and evil. We need to be prepared to discern. But we've got to prevent ourselves from being swayed by pressure, because that was Pilate's downfall. Have you ever known what the right move was? Have you ever been armed to make the right move and still made the wrong decision? If you have, then you followed the pattern of Pilate. If you know what the right thing is, you can see what the right path is, and you fail to do it, how horrible is that? Matthew 7:13 and 14, wide is the gate, broad is the way that leads to destruction. Many there be which go in thereat. Straight is the gate, narrow and difficult. Pressing in against you is that path that leads to life. And few there be that find it. There is pressure. When we set our sights down the right path, Satan and the world begin to amp up the pressure, much like they did in the life of Pilate in this instance. The preaching of the cross is to them that perish, 1 Corinthians 1, foolishness. And in our world today, the first pressure that you and I will face is shame from the world. You mean you're a Christian? How foolish is that? How ignorant can you be? And when they see that you're a follower of Christ, they're going to lump you in with uneducated and ignorant people who just don't know any better. But what did Paul say in 1 Corinthians 1? Well, that foolishness is the power of God. And we recognize that it's God's wisdom, no matter what the world may call it. You see, Pilate became a villain. He was armed to make the right decision, to release an innocent man. And yet Pilate allowed himself to be swayed by the pressures that surrounded him. This evening, don't give in to the same pressures of the world. So tonight, my question for you is, are you able to discern good and evil? Can you look at your life and see what is right and see what is wrong? If you can, then this evening there is a choice before you. If you're here tonight and you have never chosen the right path, if you've never begun your path down that straight and narrow way that leads to life, then tonight is the time to begin. Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man cometh to the Father but by me. You must come through Jesus. Jesus gave His disciples that great commission, he that believeth and is baptized shall be saved. How do you enter into Christ? Do you believe that He's the Christ, the Son of God? Are you willing to repent of your sins, to confess that faith, then be buried with Him in baptism, raised to walk a new life? But maybe this evening you are a Christian and you are tempted to give in to the pressures of the world, to become a Pilate who knows what's right, who has within his hands the power to do right and still does wrong. Tonight, maybe you've given in to those pressures. You need to come back tonight. You need to make your life right even this very hour. Obey the gospel. Be restored as together we stand and sing.